Hello dear friends, this is your personal English coach Divyam here, and in this video we are going to cover a wonderful short story known as An Angel in Disguise, written by T.S. Aurthur. On my screen you can see the exact story which I have taken from americanliterature.com. It's available online for free. What I've done is I've highlighted the difficult words and written down their meanings on the right side for your convenience, so that you can understand this story easily. Let's begin. Idleness, vice, and intemperance had done their miserable work, and the dead mother lay cold and still amid her wretched children. She had fallen upon the threshold of her own door in a drunken fit and died in the presence of her frightened little ones. So the chapter begins with a very pitiable condition. There was a woman in the village who was lazy, who did not have any job, who had bad habits, and who drank a lot of alcohol and used to do drugs. So one fine day, what happened is, in her own house, because of the effect of alcohol that she had drunken, she falls down and dies. And all of this happens in front of her own children, who looked to be in a miserable state, who were very frightened to see all of this unfold in front of their eyes. Death touches the spring of our common humanity. This woman had been despised, scoffed at, and angrily denounced by every man, woman, and child in the village. But now, as the fact of her death was passed from lip to lip in subdued tones, pity took the place of anger and sorrow of denunciation. So, as human beings, we know that death is certain. Each one of us has to die one or the other day. And if one is confronted with the fact that he or she is going to die, he or she becomes kind and generous. So the same thing happened when the news of the woman being dead passes on from lip to lip, from person to person, and the people who used to say evil things about the woman now are saying good things. The people who had left her alone now are filled with sorrow, and pity took place of anger. The people who were angry now are feeling very pity for her. Neighbors went hastily to the old tumble-down hut in which she had secured little more than a place of shelter from summer heats and winter cold, some with grave clothes for a decent interment of the body, and some with food for the half-starving children. So as soon as the neighbors heard the news of the woman who was dead, they immediately rushed to the hut of the woman, which was just about to fall, because the woman, as we already know, did not have a job, but she had secured a place, a small place in a hut somewhere. And inside the hut were two main things. One is old and tattered clothes, and second is a little bit of food for her starving children. Half starving children means hungry, very hungry children. 3 in numbers. So now we know that the woman had 3 children. So till now, we know that there was a woman who was lazy, who had bad habits, and who had this habit of drinking. She dies in front of her children. The news passes on from lip to lip, from person to person, and everybody gathers to her house, or we can say to her hut. Moving on. Of these, John, the oldest, a boy of 12, was a stout lad, able to earn his living with any farmer. Kate, between 10 and 11, was a bright, active girl, out of whom something clever might be made if in good hands. But poor little Maggie, the youngest, was hopelessly diseased. 2 years before a fall from a window had injured her spine, and she had not been able to leave her bed since, except when lifted in the arms of her mother. These particular lines describe the children of the woman who died. There were 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. The name of the boy was John, who was oldest amongst the 3, He was 12 years old and a strong boy, and he was strong enough to work with any farmer, and he could make his living all alone without his mother, living with a farmer. Kate was in between 10 and 11 years old, so we can assume that she might be maybe 10.5 years old, maybe 10 years, 1 or 2 months. That is not specified. She was an active girl, and if she was trained well by a person who was smart enough, she could give good results. But Maggie was the youngest, and she was hopelessly diseased, means she was bedridden. Why was she bedridden? Because while playing 2 years ago, she had fallen from a window, and because of this fall, she had broken her spine. With the broken spine, she obviously could not stand up, could not do any activity at all unless someone assisted her, someone came to her rescue. So, in her case, it was only her mother who would help her out in the daily errands, or we can say daily schedule. But now the mother was no more, as we saw in the earlier paragraph. What is to be done with the child? That was the chief question now. The dead mother would go underground and be forever beyond all care or concern of the villagers. But the children must not be left to starve. After considering the matter and talking it over with his wife, Farmer Jones said that he would take John and do well by him now that his mother was out of the way. And Mrs. Ellis, who had been looking out for a bound girl, concluded that it would be charitable in her to make a choice of Katie, even though she was too young to be of much use for several years. The neighbors have gathered in the women's house, as we know. Everybody is discussing only one question: what is to be done with the children? Who is gonna take care of them now that the mother has died? Now friends, there is no mention of father. It might be possible that the woman was divorced because of her habits. It might be very possible that the father has already died, maybe a couple of years back. But now that the mother was dead, everybody's asking the same question. Everybody's concerned about the 3 little children who are young enough to survive. Now, once the mother is buried, then she would be gone, which means she would be out of sight of all the villagers. Nobody was going to talk about her. Nobody is going to think about her. But once the woman is buried, the children will be left all alone, and they might starve to death because nobody is going to ask them if they are hungry or not, and they are not capable enough to find or make a living. So amongst the neighbors who were standing beside the body and standing surrounded by the children, there was a farmer who had come to her hut. His name was Farmer Jones, and Farmer Jones was thinking about his own benefit. He said that I'm going to take John because John is a boy and he will help me in my farms when he grows up. He looks very strong, so why don't I take him? So he takes away John. Farmer Jones also thought about his dead mother. He thought now that his mother was dead, there was nobody to stop him from taking John away. Mrs. Ellis, who had been looking out for a bound girl, Mrs. Ellis was one of the neighbors who always wanted a smart girl. She wanted to do some charity, and she thought, why don't I adopt Katie? Katie, everyone knew that she was a good girl and she was clever, and if somebody trained her, she could do well. And Mrs. Ellis was always in search for such a girl. So she immediately said, I will adopt Katie. Well, on the other side, Mrs. Ellis also knew that Katie might turn out to be a brat, which means a naughty little girl, and Mrs. Ellis might have to bear her tantrums, bear her naughtiness. But even though she said that she was ready for all of those things, I could do much better, I know, said Mrs. Ellis, But as no one seems inclined to take her, I must act from a sense of duty. Expect to have trouble with the child, for she's an undisciplined thing, used to having her own way. So, as we already discussed, Mrs. Ellis knew about the fact that Katie was an undisciplined child. She was naughty and she used to do things her own way, but Mrs. Ellis was ready for all of these tantrums. But no one said, "I'll take Maggie." Pitying glances were cast on her van, and wasted form and thoughts were troubled on her account. Mothers brought cast-off garment, and removing her soiled and ragged clothes, dressed her in clean attire. The sad eyes and patient faces of little one touched many hearts, and even knocked at them for entrance, but none opened to take her in. Who wanted a bedridden child? By now we already know that out of the 3 siblings, 2 were adopted, John and Katie. But nobody talked about Maggie. We already know that Maggie was bedridden, her back was broken, she couldn't do anything by herself. And also, all the neighbors were thinking about their own benefit. Because Maggie couldn't move, because Maggie was handicapped, nobody thought about her. Nobody said, "Okay, I'll take Maggie. I'll take her home. I will adopt her." Pitying glances. People looked at Maggie with glances full of pity. Cast on her van. Van is pale and giving the impression of illness or exhaustion. So friends, I hope you are noting down the meanings of the difficult words, because that will help you when you revise the chapter. So everybody was looking at Maggie with a full of pitiable looks, and they were aware that Maggie was a helpless and troubled child. The mothers who had gathered around Maggie did one thing. They had brought rejected clothes from their houses, and what they did is removed the soiled and ragged, which means old and worn and torn clothes, from Maggie's body and dressed her into a very clean attire. Maggie looked at everyone with sad eyes and a patient face, and her eyes told everyone to take her away. Maggie looked at everyone with a pleading gesture, which means she wanted someone to take her away badly. She knew that she was alone. But the main question is, who wanted a bedridden child? Now, who would take a person or a child who was bedridden and look after her? Everybody was looking for their own benefit. "Take her to the poorhouse," said a rough man, of whom the question, "What's to be done with Maggie?" was asked. "Nobody's going to be bothered with her. The poorhouse is a sad place for sick and helpless child," answered one. "For your child or mine," said the other, politely speaking. "But for this brat, it will prove a blessed change. She will be kept clean, have healthy food, and be doctored, which is more than can be said of a past condition." The neighbors were discussing what's to be done with one last child that was left out, which is Maggie. There was a rough man, which means a man who looked pretty rough and tough, and he said, "Just put her to the poorhouse." Now, poorhouse is a place where poor people are kept and taken care of. And when that man was asked about Maggie, he said, "Why don't we put her to a poorhouse?" And then he said, "Nobody is going to be bothered with her," which means Maggie is not going to be a hindrance to anyone. She'll stay there and she'll be alright. Somebody said the poorhouse is a sad place for a sick and helpless child. Somebody was concerned about Maggie, so somebody objected. The rough man replied again, "That might be true for your or my child, but it's not true for Maggie, because for Maggie it will prove a blessed change. Maggie will be kept clean, she will have healthy food, and a doctor will take care of her nicely." So the rough man said, if we were supposed to put our children into a poorhouse, it could be a sick and sad place. But for Maggie, because she doesn't have anything, at least she'll have clean clothes and good food and good doctors around, and it will be much better than the condition what she is in right now. There was a reason in that, but still didn't satisfy. The day following the day of death was made the death of burial. A few neighbors were at the miserable hovel, but none followed dead cart as it bore the unhonored remains to its pauper grave. Farmer Jones, after the coffin was taken out, placed John in his wagon and drove away, satisfied that he had done his part. Mrs. Ellis spoke to Kate with a hurried air, bid your sister goodbye, and drew the tearful children apart, ere scarcely their lips had touched in a sobbing farewell. Hastily others went out, some glancing at Maggie and some resolutely refraining from a look, until all had gone. She was all alone just beyond the threshold. Joe Thompson, the wheelwright, paused and said to the blacksmith's wife, who was hastening off with the rest, "It's a cruel thing to leave her so." The neighbors were reasoning out all the conditions that Maggie could survive. One particular option was to put her to poorhouse, and that looked all right, but it still did not satisfy all the neighbors. The neighbors inside their hearts knew that poorhouse can be a bad place for Maggie because she was troubled and bedridden and helpless. So the neighbors were still discussing about the possible conditions that Maggie could be in, and while everything was going on, the next day their mother, the children's mother, was buried. So that's why it's written, the day following the day of death of the woman was made the day of burial. And few neighbors were there at the miserable hovel. Hovel is a small place or small dwelling. But none followed the dead cart as it bore the unhonored remains to its pauper grave. Nobody wanted to take the ownership of the woman who just died, of the poor woman who did not have a job, who was in bad habits. So you can imagine a wagon going on, or a cart taking its dead body to the grave, and nobody amongst the neighbors following the cart because nobody wanted to take the ownership. So all the neighbors stayed at the hut. Farmer Jones, after the coffin was taken out, after the dead body was taken away from the house, Farmer Jones immediately asked John to sit in his wagon, and he immediately drove away, satisfied that he has done his charity part. Mrs. Ellis immediately took Kate away and asked her to say goodbye to her sister who was bedridden. And all the three brothers and sisters were drifted apart before even they could hug each other and cry and say goodbye. And the remaining neighbors went out. The neighbors knew that there was one child remaining, but nobody wanted to adopt her. They confidently abstained to look at her. And everybody was gone. Maggie was all alone in her hut. The hut was empty. There was one person who was just about to leave, Joe Thompson. He was a wheelwright. Who's a wheelwright? He's a person who makes or repairs wooden wheels in the village. Now, the wheelwright saw the blacksmith's wife. Blacksmith is a person who makes and repairs things in iron by hands. Joe Thompson was double-minded at this point. He was really shattered by the thoughts of Maggie being alone. So he said to the blacksmith's wife, "It's not right to keep Maggie like this in this condition." But blacksmith's wife, she said, "Then take her to the poorhouse. She'll have to go there," answered the blacksmith's wife, springing away, leaving Joe behind. For a little while the man stood with the puzzled air. Then he turned back and went into the hovel again. Maggie, with the painful effort, had raised herself to an upright position and was sitting on bed, straining her eyes upon the door out of which all had just departed. A vague terror had come in her thin white face. So blacksmith's wife immediately said that the only place where Maggie can be safe and all right is a poor's house, which also means that she didn't want to take her. She rejected her and she didn't want someone to ask her to take her house. So she rejected her and asked Joe to take her to the poorhouse. Now Joe stood confused. He did not know what to do. He was about to go out, but then he turned back because he was the last person to leave the house. As soon as he turned back, Maggie was already petrified, already frightened looking at all of this. She stood up somehow with some effort on her bed and strained her eyes upon the door, out of which all had left. A vague terror. She was in extreme fear, and that was seen on her face. Why she was terrified? Because everybody left and she was the last one. There was nobody to care about her. So when Joe turned back, she raised herself up and she said, "Oh, Mr. Thompson," she cried out, catching her suspended breath, "don't leave me here all alone." Though rough in exterior, Joe Thompson of the wheelwright had a heart, and it was very tender in some places. He liked children and was pleased to have them come to his shop, where sleds and wagons were made or mended for the village lads without a draft on their hoarded sixpences. So, as soon as Joe turned back, Maggie cried, "Please don't leave me alone. Please take me along with you." Joe Thompson was also a rough-looking guy, but he had a kind heart. He loved children, and he loved children coming to his shops, and sometimes he made toys for them, and he repaired toys for the children without taking money. "No, dear," he answered in a kind voice, going to the bed and stooping down over the child. "You shall not be left here alone." Then he wrapped her with gentleness almost of women in the clean bedclothes which some neighbors had brought, and lifting her in his strong arms, bore her out into the air and across the field that lay between hovel and his home. Joe had made up his mind that "I am going to take her away." So Joe tells Maggie that "You are not going to be left alone out here. I'm going to take you home." So what he did is he wrapped Maggie within his arms, and with a very gentle touch she was taken away by John out of the house into the field. Now you can imagine hut on one side and Joe's home on the other side, and in between there was a field on which Joe took Maggie into the fresh air. Now Joe Thompson's wife, who happened to be childless, was not a woman of saintly temper, nor much given to self-denial for others' good, and Joe had well-grounded doubts touching the manner of greeting he should receive on his arrival. Joe Thompson's wife was not a good-tempered wife. She was ill-tempered. And why was this? Because Joe and his wife could not conceive, could not have a child. They did not have a child for some or the other reason. They were childless, and because of this fact, they had not really they, only the wife had turned into a ill-tempered person, and she didn't like good happening to others. So Joe was very well aware that as soon as he reaches his own house, his wife is not going to be happy seeing him bring a helpless child at home. He was very sure that he would not be greeted nicely once his wife sees everything. Mrs. Thompson saw him approaching from the window, and with ruffling feathers met him a few paces from the door as he opened the garden gate, and he came in. He bore a precious burden, and he felt it to be so. As his arms held the sick child to his breast, a sphere of tenderness went out from her and penetrated his feelings. A bond had already corded itself around them both, and love was springing into life. Let's check out the meaning of corded. Corded is actually bind, because a cord is a metallic wire which binds two things. So bond had already corded itself around them both. So let's understand this paragraph. We know that Joe's wife was an ill-tempered wife. So Mrs. Thompson, she saw from her window that her husband was approaching with something in his hand, and she ran to the door and opened the garden gate. As he came in, he bore a precious burden, and he felt it to be so. Joe Thompson had a sick child in his hands. And why it is written precious burden? Because the child couldn't move. She was helpless and troubled. That's why the word burden is used. Why precious? Because they didn't have a child. So according to Joe, she was very precious, and therefore precious burden is used. And as his arms held the sick child to his breast, a sphere of tenderness went out from her and penetrated his feelings. So by now, Joe had already made a bond with the sick child. The small girl had already given vibes so strong that Joe felt a bond with the little girl. "What have you there?" sharply questioned Mrs. Thompson. Joe felt the child start and shrink against him. He did not reply, except by a look that was pleading and cautionary. That said, "Wait a moment for explanations and be gentle." And passing in, carried Maggie to a small chamber on the floor and laid her on the bed. Then, stepping back, he shut the door and stood face to face with his vinegar-tempered wife in the passageway outside. "You haven't brought home that sick brat!" Anger and astonishment were in the tones of Mrs. Joe Thompson. Her face was in a flame. So Joe was already aware that he would not be greeted nicely, and the same thing happened. Mrs. Thompson immediately asked, "What have you there in your hands? What is that?" And the child heard these things, and she started shrinking in Joe's hand, being scared. So Joe did not reply, and he gave a very strong look to his wife and said, "Don't shout, don't be angry. Wait for me to explain and be kind. Don't act like this." And he passed on from his wife, and he carried Maggie to a small chamber which was there in his house on the first floor, and he put her there. He stepped back, shut the door, so that the child wouldn't hear the quarrel which was going to happen between Joe and his wife. Vinegar tempered is bad tempered again. Couple of words used here to describe his wife's temper. So as soon as he placed the little girl in a small chamber, he came out, he shut the door, and then another question was thrown to Joe. "You haven't brought that sick brat?" His wife immediately asked, "Don't tell me that you have brought the sick and helpless child home." She was angry, she was shocked at what Joe did, and her face was all red. "I think women's hearts are sometimes very hard," said Joe. Usually Joe Thompson got out of his wife's way or kept rigidly silent and non-combative when she fired up on any subject. It was with some surprise, therefore, that she now encountered a firmly set countenance and resolute pair of eyes. Hearing this, he said to his wife that sometimes women's hearts are not tender, sometimes they are not kind, they are not logical. That's what Joe told his wife. And then he got out of his way and kept rigidly silent. He didn't want to fight with his wife, therefore he stayed in a non-combative mode, because he knew that his wife was going to fire up and throw questions after questions about Maggie. And therefore Joe gave her a very strong look, warning her to be silent and to not behave badly. Women's hearts are not half so hard as men's. Joe saw by a quick intuition that his resolute bearing had impressed his wife, and he answered quickly with a real indignation. "Be that as it may, every woman at the funeral turned her eyes steadily from the sick child's face, and when the cart went off with dead mother, hurried away and left alone in that old hut with the sun not an hour in the sky." So Joe told his wife that women are not kind, and By Joe's look, his wife was calmed down. His wife had settled a little bit from her anger, and Joe noticed that. And he said that if you want to think that women's heart are kind, you can think. But what I saw is all the mothers who had gathered in the hut run away as soon as the body was buried. So what I think, or what Joe thinks, is women's hearts are not kind. If their hearts were kind, they would have taken the responsibility of a sick child. So now there is a conversation going on between Joe and his wife about how women are. Are they kind or unkind? They were not kind according to Joe because he had seen all the mothers run away, but they were kind according to his wife. Where were John and Kate? Asked Mrs. Thompson. Farmer Jones tossed John into his wagon and drove off. Katie went home with Mrs. Ellis, but nobody wanted to pick the sick one. Send her to the poorhouse, was the cry. So Joe's wife is asking him about the remaining two siblings. She said, where are John and Kate? And to the response, Joe said that Farmer Jones took John away and Mrs. Ellis took Kate away, but nobody cared about Maggie. Mrs. Thompson immediately said, why don't we send her to the poorhouse? Because Mrs. Thompson also did not want the responsibility of a sick child. Why didn't you go? Why didn't you let her go then? What did you bring her here for? She can't walk to the poorhouse, said Joe. Somebody's arms must carry her, and mine are strong enough for that. So Joe's wife is asking him as to why he didn't let her go by herself to the poorhouse, to which Joe is responding that she is sick, she cannot walk. How can she go to the poorhouse all alone walking? Somebody needs to take care of her. Somebody's arms need to lift her all the time, and only then she can be taken to the poorhouse. Then why didn't you keep on? Why did you stop here? Demanded the wife. So the wife said, why did you come walking all the way, picking her up to our house? You could have just picked her up from her own hut till the poorhouse. Why did you stop here? Why did you come to our own house? Because I'm not apt to go on fool's errands. The guardians must be first seen and permit obtained. There was no gainsaying this. So Joe said that I'm not a fool. I need to follow the procedure. If you want someone to be put in poorhouse, then the owners of the poorhouse, or we can say the guardians of the poorhouse, must be made aware that some person is coming to your poorhouse, and we need to take a permit from them, and only then someone can be admitted to the poorhouse. Now, to this, Joe's wife did not argue because she knew that he was right. When will you see the guardians? Was asked with irrepressible impatience. The meaning of irrepressible is not able to be controlled or restrained. Now, at this point, we already know that Joe's wife did not want Maggie. She wanted to get rid of her anyhow. So she's throwing questions after questions after questions. So as soon as Joe said that we need to meet guardians first to admit her to the poorhouse, his wife says, when are you going to see the guardians? Joe said, tomorrow. Why put off till tomorrow? Go at once for the permit and get the whole thing off of your hands tonight. So as I said, Joe's wife wanted to get rid of Maggie. At this moment, she did not want to take care of Maggie at all. So when Joe said that he need to take permit from the guardians, and he said he'll go tomorrow, his wife did not even want to wait till tomorrow. And his wife told him to go right now, get the permit, and admit Maggie there. Jane, said the wheelwright with an impressive tone of that greatly subdued his wife, I read in Bible sometimes and find much said about the little children, how the Savior rebuked the disciple who would not receive them, how he took them up in his arms and blessed them, and how he said that whosoever gave them even a cup of cold water should not go unrewarded. Now, it's a small thing for us to keep this poor motherless little one for a single night, to be kind to her for a single night, to make her little comfortable for a single night. Joe saw that his wife was constantly asking him to get rid of Maggie. So now he was a little angry, he was a little furious at her arguments, and he calmed her down even more. He said that he saw a verse written in Bible about children and told her that Bible sometimes has a lot of admiration for children. He said that there are many verses written about children in which there is a savior and his disciples, and the savior would rebuke. The meaning of rebuke is disapproval. So if the disciples misbehaved with children or did bad to the children, the savior would punish them. Who's the savior? None other than Jesus. So Jesus would punish everybody who was bad to children. So Joe is telling his wife that there is a mention in Bible about loving children, and even if the disciples gave glass of water, just a glass of water, and the savior would be happy. So Joe quotes the lines from Bible and tries to explain to his wife and tries to calm her down even more. And he says that if we take care of Maggie, then God is watching and we will not go unrewarded. Joe tells his wife that it was a very small thing to take care of this little helpless child just for one single night. Then we might put her to the poorhouse. The voice of the strong, rough man shook, and he turned his head away so that moisture in his eyes might not be seen. Mrs. Thompson did not answer, but a soft feeling crept into her heart. Mrs. Thompson understood what Joe was saying, and Joe, while he was speaking, he became a little emotional, so he was just about to burst into tears. And usually a man doesn't cry in front of everyone, and therefore Joe as well did not want his tears to be seen. And so while he was about to cry, he turned his back, and Mrs. Thompson saw that Joe was really emotional and he was about to cry, and therefore she understood. She became softer. "Look at her kindly, Jane. Speak to her kindly," said Joe. "Think of her dead mother and the loneliness, the pain, the sorrow that must be on all her coming life." The softness of his heart gave unwanted eloquence to his lips. Joe exactly knew Maggie's future. He knew that Maggie was lost and Maggie's life was gonna be miserable after what happened. So when his wife wanted to reject Maggie, Joe was constantly trying to explain her that Maggie's life is very miserable. Please think about her life. Please understand. Let's take care of her for just one night. Mrs. Thompson did not reply, but presently turned towards the little chamber where her husband had deposited Maggie, and pushing open the door, went quietly in. Joe did not follow. He saw that her state had changed and felt that it would be best to leave her alone with the child. So he went to his shop, which stood near the house, and worked until dusky evening released him from labor. A light shining through the little chamber window was the first object that attracted Joe's attention on turning towards the house. It was a good omen. The path led him by windows, and when opposite, he could not help pausing, looking in. It was now dark enough outside to screen him from observation. Let's understand these lines first. So after the argument that happened between Joe and his wife, Joe realized that his wife was now cooling down a little bit. Joe realized that his wife was being a little kind than she was before, and he noticed that his wife, the thoughts of his wife were changing. So Joe and his wife stopped the argument, and to Joe's question, Mrs. Thompson did not respond. And then she looked at the little chamber. She realized what Joe was saying, and she pushed open the door and she went in to just analyze Maggie and her situation. Joe didn't follow because he knew that his wife was changing now. Her state had changed. And Joe thought that let me give some time to my wife and understand the situation. Let she realize what Maggie and her condition is, and let me go and work and let me leave everything else to God. So he went to the shop which stood near the house. So Joe's shop, we know that he was a wheelwright. So his shop was just near the house and he worked till evening. He did not really think about Maggie and his wife's interaction or interpersonal relationship. He went on working. But in the evening, when it was a little dark, it was dusk, he could see that the window, which was never lit in his house, had lights turned on. And it was dark enough now, so he could see his house and light being turned on in his own house. And therefore he understood that if the light was turned on, it would mean that his wife was taking care of Maggie, and it was good luck and good omen. The path led him by this window, and when opposite he could not help pausing to look in. It was now dark outside, so he could see clearly. Maggie was lying there, and she was raised on a pillow, and there was a lamp shining upon her face. So Joe is standing somewhere at his shop, and he is looking at the window. In fact, looking through the window, what he could see is Maggie was upright. There were pillows to support her, and there was a lamp lit upon her face. Mrs. Thompson was sitting by the bed talking to the child, but her back was towards the window, so that her countenance was not seen. From Maggie's face, therefore, Joe must read the character of their intercourse. He saw that her eyes were intently fixed upon his wife, that now and then a few words came, as if in answer from her lips, that her expression was sad and tender, but he saw nothing of bitterness or pain. A deep drawn breath was followed by one of relief as the weight lifted itself from his heart. Joe did leave for his shop for his work, but inside he was actually anxious about the interaction that would happen between his wife and the child. So he was constantly judging from a distance as to what might have happened in the evening. So one thing he saw was a light was seen from a distance, and that was the first sign that everything was going well between his wife and the little child. On top of that, he saw that from the window he could only see Maggie's face, and his wife was talking to her. So his wife was facing Maggie, and therefore his wife's back and back of the head was seen from the window, but not his wife's face. And every now and then he saw that Maggie's lips fluttered, which means Maggie was actually having a conversation with Joe's wife. So this brought a lot of relief to Joe, and he was satisfied, relaxed, and he was not anxious anymore. He felt as if the weight was lifted from his heart. On entering, Joe did not go immediately to the little chamber. His heavy tread about the kitchen brought his wife somewhat hurriedly from the room where she had been with Maggie. Joe thought it best not to refer to the child, nor to manifest any concern to her. There are a couple of words here that you can learn. Tread is nothing but walk. Let me write down for your reference. And to manifest is obvious, patent, apparent, evident. So what happened is Joe came into his house, and his footsteps were heard by his wife, and his wife immediately came down from the room where Maggie was placed, and Joe knew that everything was going well, so he didn't really ask any questions about Maggie. How soon will supper be ready? He asked. Right soon, answered Mrs. Thompson, beginning to bustle about. There was no asperity in her voice. After washing from his hands and face to dust and soil of work, Joe left the kitchen and went to the little bedroom A pair of large, bright eyes looked up at him from the snowy bed, looked at him tenderly, gratefully, pleadingly. How his heart swelled in his bosom. With what a quicker motion came the heartbeats. Joe sat down and now, for the first time, examining the thin frame carefully under the lamplight, saw that it was an attractive face and full of childish sweetness, which suffering had not been able to obliterate. So we know that Joe came to his own house hungry and tired. And Joe also wanted to ask a lot of questions about what conversations happened with Maggie and his wife. But he didn't really mention anything because he had already seen from a distance that everything was well. So he diverted the subject and asked, "When will the dinner be ready? Supper is dinner." Mrs. Thompson came to the kitchen and said, "Right soon. I'm going to make the dinner right soon. Please wait for some time." And when she said that, there was no anger in her voice, which was another indication that she was not unhappy anymore, like she was before when Joe brought the little child. After washing his hands and face, after getting a little clean, Joe waited for supper to be cooked, and he went up to the little bedroom where Maggie was placed. Maggie was looking at him intently with a lot of gratefulness, a lot of thankfulness, a lot of requests, a lot of kindness, and how his heart swelled in his bosom. What a quick emotion came to the heartbeat. So as soon as Joe saw Maggie, he was a new person because he was kinder. Joe sat down and now for the first time examining thin frame carefully. So now Joe was observing Maggie carefully because he didn't really get time to observe how she looked and how she behaved. Joe saw Maggie's face, and Maggie was very young, even less than 10 years old. And she was childish, she was sweet, and her face didn't really show any suffering about her health, nor about the fact that she was poor and starving. "Your name is Maggie?" he said, as he sat down and took a soft little hand in his. "Yes, sir." Her voice struck a chord that quivered in low strain of music. "Have you been sick long?" "Yes, sir." What a sweet patience was in her tone. "Has the doctor been to see you?" "He used to come, but not lately." "No, sir." "Have you any pain?" "Sometimes, but not now." "When had you pain?" "The morning my side ached and my back hurt when you carried me." "It hurts you to be lifted or moved about?" So now there's a conversation going on between Joe and Maggie. Joe wanted to ask a lot of questions, as we know. So he's asking him, "How long have you been ill?" She said, "From a long time." And when she said, there was sweetness and patience and a lot of childishness. He said if the doctor was taking care of her. To that, Maggie replied that he used to come, but he hasn't seen me from a couple of days. Joe inquired her about her pain, if she was having any pain or trouble right now in her body. She said, "Yeah, it did ache in the past, but right now I'm alright." Joe said, "When was the last time that you had pain?" She said, "This morning. My side ached and my back hurt when you carried me." So, as we know, her spine was broken, so when somebody carried her, it did hurt. That's what she replied to Joe. "It hurts you to be lifted or moved about?" So Joe said, "Whenever anyone lifts you or moves you around, does it always hurt?" Maggie said, "Yes." "Your side doesn't ache now? Do you feel any pain right now?" "No." "Does it ache a great deal?" Joe is asking her if it pains a lot when somebody carries her. "Yes, sir, but it hasn't ached any since I've been on the soft bed." So this is a very touching line because, as we know, Maggie was poor and her mother was lazy and without a job, so she could never afford a soft bed. So when Joe is asking her if there was any pain, she said, "It used to pain when I was in my bed, which was really rough, but this bed of yours is very soft and I don't really feel any pain at all. The soft bed feels good." "Oh, yes, sir, so good." What a satisfaction mingled with gratitude was in her voice. "Supper is ready," said Mrs. Thompson, looking into the room a little while afterwards. Joe glanced from his wife's face to that of Maggie. She understood him and answered, "She can wait until we're done. Then I will bring some things to eat." There was an effort at indifference on the part of Mrs. Thompson, but her husband had seen her through the window and understood that the coldness was assumed. So now, Joe's wife came saying that the dinner was ready. Let's have dinner together. What happened is Joe looked at the little Maggie, signaling his wife that what about Maggie? What is Maggie gonna eat? So his wife understood that signal and she answered, "Maggie can wait until we have finished eating. Once we have finished eating, I'm gonna get something for her." So when she said that, Joe felt as if there was a little bad temper seen in those words. There was a little hatred seen. But as Joe had already seen Mrs. Thompson and Maggie conversating, he didn't really defend her. Joe waited after sitting down to the table for his wife to introduce the subject uppermost in both of the thoughts. But she kept silent on that theme for many minutes and he maintained a like reserve. At last she said abruptly, "What are you going to do with that child?" So, we already know that the most concerning topic in Joe's house was Maggie. So while they were having dinner, both of them wanted to ask and talk about only one thing, about Maggie. When is she gonna go from the house? How is she? What is she feeling at this moment? But both of them kept silent. Joe kept silent because he did not really want to argue. So he waited. He was patient. He didn't really bring up the topic of Maggie. But finally, Joe's wife asked the question, what was he going to do with Maggie? Joe said, "I thought you understood me, that she was going to the poorhouse," replied Joe as if surprised at a question. Joe had already discussed with his wife that Maggie was going to the poorhouse. But now that Joe's wife had a little change of heart, she is reiterating the question. It may mean that she does not want Maggie to be put to the poorhouse. Therefore, she is reiterating the question. She said, "What are you going to do with the child?" So Joe is a little surprised. And he said, "I thought you knew that we are going to put her to the poorhouse." Mrs. Thompson looked at rather strangely at her husband for a sonic moment and then dropped her eyes. The subject was not again referred to during the meal. At its close, Mrs. Thompson toasted a slice of bread and softened it with milk and butter. Adding to the cup of tea, she took them into Maggie and held a small waiter on which she had placed them, while the hungry child ate with every sign of pleasure. Mrs. Thompson has a change of heart at this moment, and once they had finished their dinner, she is really not wanting Maggie to be placed in the poorhouse, so she has strange expressions on her face. And she took dinner for Maggie. So for dinner, she took a slice of bread, softened it with milk and butter, adding this to the cup of tea. All of these things for Maggie. She took them all to Maggie, and there was a tray-like thing at her bed on which she placed everything, and Maggie ate with all the satisfaction, with all the pleasure, because she had never eaten such nice food. "Is it good?" asked Mrs. Thompson, seeing with what keen relish the food was taken. The child paused with the cup in her hand and answered with a look of gratitude that awoke a new life, old human feelings, which had been slumbering in her heart for half a score of years. We know that Joe and his wife were childless, and when Joe's wife took this food for Maggie, Maggie showed signs of pleasure because she had never eaten such food. And to this, Mrs. Thompson is asking a question. Is it good? Do you like the food? So the child paused and said that it was great. She looked with gratitude. She looked with happiness. And these feelings awakened something in Mrs. Thompson's mind. the old human feeling which had died down in Mrs. Thompson's heart for many, many years because they didn't have a child. We'll keep her a day or two longer. She is so weak and helpless, said Mrs. Joe Thompson in answer to her husband's remark at breakfast time next morning, that he must step down and see the guardians of the poor about Maggie. So the next day, while they were having breakfast, Joe brought this topic again about putting Maggie to the poorhouse, and Joe said, "Let me go to the guardians and talk to them and get the permit and place Maggie there." But Mrs. Thompson has a change of heart and she stops Joe from doing that. Mrs. Joe Thompson says, "Why don't we keep her a day or two more? Because she's helpless, she cannot move. How is she going to survive in the poorhouse?" Joe wanted the same thing, but even then, Joe asks this question in sarcasm. "She'll be so much in your way. She's going to trouble you. You'll have to do so much for her. Don't you want to put her to the poorhouse as we discussed a couple of days before?" "I shall not mind that for a day or two." "Poor thing. She says it's all right for me. I'm going to take care of her. I think it's all right for me to take care of this helpless child." Joe did not see the guardians of the poor on the next day, nor on the day following. In fact, he never saw them at all on Maggie's account, for in less than a week, Mrs. Joe Thompson would as soon leave thought of taking up her own abode in the almshouse as sending Maggie there. So, after the discussion they had, Joe never really thought about putting Maggie to the poorhouse. So, although Joe and his wife had decided to take an appointment to the poorhouse and with the guardians, they never did so. Not on that day, not on the next day. They never did. And in less than a week, Mrs. Joe Thompson had discarded the thought of putting Maggie to the poorhouse at all. What a light and blessing did that sick and helpless child bring to the home of Joe Thompson, the poor wheelwright. It had been dark and cold and miserable there for a long time just because his wife had nothing to love and care for out of herself, and so became sore, irritable, ill-tempered, self-afflicting in the desolation of her woman's nature. We've seen how Mrs. Thompson had a change of mind, change of heart. Her feelings changed completely. Because they were childless, Mrs. Joe Thompson had nobody to care about, and she had become irritable, annoying, bad-tempered, ill-tempered, angry, furious because of all these reasons. But now she had someone to take care of. And in that process, she was a changed person. So all of this brought light and blessing. Even Joe was relaxed because his wife was not the same person anymore. And all of this was only because of Maggie, a sick and helpless child. These lines are very deep and most important. Now the sweetness of that sick child, looking ever to her in love, patience and gratitude, was as honey to her soul, and she carried her in her heart as well as in her arms, a precious burden. Sweetness of Maggie, who was always looking to both of them, Joe and his wife, in love, patience and gratitude. She always looked at them with a lot of gratefulness, and those feelings were honey to her damaged soul. To whose soul? To Joe's wife's soul. So all of this seemed like honey to her soul. She loved when Maggie looked at her like that, and therefore Joe's wife carried her around in her arms because she was handicapped, and in her heart, which means she cared a lot about her. A precious burden. As for Joe Thompson, there was not a man in all the neighborhood who drank daily of a more precious wine of life than he. Which means Joe Thompson lived life to the fullest, and he understood what actually life is. Life is about caring for others. So therefore that it states Joe Thompson was the only person in the whole village or in the whole neighborhood who knew what life was, and therefore it's mentioned drank daily of a more precious wine of life. So he was getting lessons from life. He understood what life is. Life is about caring for others. An angel had come into the house, disguised as a sick, helpless, and miserable child, and filled all its dreary chambers with the sunshine of love. Dreary is lacking in liveliness and charm or surprise. So the house which was lacking liveliness was full of love, full of sunshine, full of happiness. Why? Because an angel named Maggie had come disguised as a sick child, or camouflaged as a sick child. So she was an angel who actually brought happiness to Joe Thompson and his wife. Friends, this is a very wonderful short story, I must say. T.S. Aurthur, hats off to you. I'm going to upload a couple of more videos as requested by you in the comment section in my previous video. If you have liked this videos and if you've understood it well, do like this video. Share it with your friends. I would suggest that all of you should gather in a room, put my video on speaker and listen to this chapter at a full volume. Once you have listened to this chapter, sit in a room and discuss about what happened. By that, you would not have to revise at all before the day of exams. I thank you and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.